Today's the day. It's time to finally address the river situation that we have at the base of our pathway here. Something that I've hinted at for the first handful of episodes here in this series is that I want to do some work on the river. It empties out into the ocean off in that direction, and it goes all the way back towards spawn inland in that direction. And while it does both of those things, it doesn't do either one too effectively. As you can see over in this direction, we've got a couple of hills that are kind of blocking its pathway back towards that part of the island. And as it swoops in over in this direction, it gets very narrow right here. I've got only a couple of scaffolding as a little bridge across it before it tries to go out towards the ocean that way. And there's even some more parts down the way where it could be widened out quite a bit as well. And I think for the overall goal of what I want to do with this world, and especially in this area around where we've started to build up, getting this river to a state where I'm much happier with it is going to be super important before we can properly move on to building things over on this side of the river or continuing to focus on things on that side of the forest. One thing that I talked about when we built up this forest right here is that there are going to be 3 zones to this world, 3 different areas with distinct build styles. We obviously have our first area right here with our big tree and our house up on the hill. This is going to be our fantasy area, and then the other 2 I haven't specified yet, but we at least know where they're going to be. And the forest is one of the markers, one of the indicators or dividers, if you will, of these 2 areas. Everything on that side of the forest is going to represent one of the other areas. And then the river is our other border. So everything on this side of the river, for as far down as it expands back in that direction, and then maybe off to the left, everything over here is going to be its own area with its own unique build style. All of that being said, with our goal to build everything in this world on a larger scale than what I'm used to and kind of play around with just larger scale building in general, that sort of line of thinking has to also apply to a lot of the terrain, whether it's terraforming or working on rivers or whatever the case might be. We don't want to have it to where we're only building really large things and keeping a lot of the terrain as it is, this sort of vanilla Minecraft style, which isn't necessarily bad per se, but would definitely feel a little out of place, or the other way around. The builds that we do could feel out of place if we don't adjust the terrain to what we need. So the first thing that I want to work on in this episode is I want to work on trying to plan out how we are going to make this river a little bit better. Well, I say plan out, but what I really mean by that is start to kind of dig out an area, or at least come up with some sort of outline for where I expand it and how wide I make it, as well as taking note of all of the areas that we need to adjust, such as the hills that way or any gaps over in this direction where the river might not connect on its way out to the ocean. So I'm going to grab myself some wool from the sheep shearing station that we set up on the previous episode and use that to sort of dot along and outline what I want to do with our river. All right, I've taken to laying out all of the red wool, I've taken to laying out all of the red wool around this area here, and I was going to continue back towards the spawn region that way with the big hills we had there, but as I was laying out the wool in this direction, it did occur to me just how much terraforming is going to be needed because we have a couple of these hills that are elevated quite a bit off of sea level, and specifically the one I'm standing on right here. Now, what this means is that it's not just going to be dirt and grass and sand that we're digging out, but we're also going to have to go through some stone and andesite and granite and all of that kind of stuff. And I don't have any beacons to do that in an effective manner. At least not yet, not this early into the world. That is something that I want to do shortly. I want to try and get taken care of, but there are some other things on the agenda first. So it's probably going to be a little bit before we get to that point. And what that means is that this alone, just going up to this bend right here, is going to be quite a project. It's going to require a lot of time and a lot of digging because of that. So I haven't laid out anything further into the spawn region over there, and I think for right now, we're just going to focus on where the river's good and where it empties out this way into the ocean right there. And I think we'll kind of split the river into halves in that sense, where we'll focus on this and try to get this done now. And then we'll save that next part that kind of stretches further inland over there. We'll save that for in the future. So with all of that in mind, I think we can get started on getting this ready. So to get started, what I'm going to do is everywhere along where I've dotted the red wool, where it goes kind of up on these hills, is I'm just going to kind of follow the line I have, and And I'm just going to dig these all the way down to wherever the surface level is. Maybe not necessarily water level, but I just want to even the terrain out for the most part. And it will look really weird. We're just going to have these hills chopped in half, but I'm going to save the terraforming and fixing of everything on the edges for after we at least get the full river in itself. So we're going to chop some hills in half. We're going to get rid of all of the grass and these flowers and trees and animals and clear the whole area out nice and good. And once I've done all of that, before I get to the bulk of it, which will be expanding the water, I'm actually going to leave the outlines of the river. It'll look a little something like this, where all along the edges of the river, I just kind of leave this 1 block gap so that I can dig out where we're going to have the riverbed itself. I can kind of lay all of that out nice and good without having to do all of that underwater. I can keep it from being submerged, which makes our job so much easier. And then, in the final step, of course, that's when we'll have to flood the whole thing, which will also involve getting rid of these walls right here. And then we'll have to fix some of these blocks that raise up where the old riverbed met the old surface. That's enough rambling for me, though. I just wanted to kind of explain how I'm going to get all of this done. I think if we want any hopes of getting this river where I want it to be, we got to get started. So it's been a couple of days at this point, and countless hours have gone into the river, but I think it's been time well spent. We've got a lot of progress made on widening it out here. You'll notice a couple of things right off the bat. For number one, there's this little island in the middle of the river right here. This was kind of a natural formation that I decided to leave in place, just as a nice little area of intrigue. We're going to need a couple of those, especially because one of the other things you'll notice is that it's all just dirt under there, and so you lose a little bit of that vanilla Minecraft kind of patchiness where you'll get sand or clay or gravel kind of intermixed throughout the base of the river here. And I didn't want to go to that much effort in the expansion here to try to match that vanilla kind of feel to it. One thing I am going to do is I'm going to go collect a bunch of seagrass to plant around the area just to kind of make it feel a little more natural. But I think leaving it all as dirt for the most part will be totally fine. And I think for the shape of the river that we've got in place, this should work pretty well for us. One of the things that I do intend to do is build a bridge that goes across the river. But the biggest thing is that I wanted a river that felt like a river, not like a stream or a creek or so, but rather something that would require like a proper bridge build to go across, something that we could really kind of get creative with and make something cool out of on a little bit of a larger scale, right? So we've got that planned. That bridge will start from somewhere over here. I might even take this path a little up the hill and have the bridge kind of connect a little higher up and then shoot across. We might build up a little bit of a hill on that side for it to connect to as well before it kind of winds down into the rest of the area. And speaking of terraforming, there is quite a bit of terraforming that's still required along the edges. So I explained before that I was just going to kind of cut all of these hills in half right where we were going to do the river, and then from there we would kind of figure out the surface level stuff after the fact. So my idea for this area is, instead of taking each of these sheer cliff sides and just kind of flattening them out and then blending them with the terrain behind, what we're actually going to do is we're going to take the natural flow of the terrain that the world generated, and we're going to turn those into cliff faces in instances like this, or this right here. And then in areas where the terrain kind of swoops down to more of a normal level, we'll work with something that's more of kind of a natural blend where it just kind of comes right up to the side of the river. The river bank, that's the word I'm looking for. We'll make a little bit of a river bank situation over here. Something nice, something simple, not too crazy. And that way we can get a little bit of a mix of a bit of a subtle blend right here, and then some cool little cliff faces overhanging the river and kind of accenting it along the side as well. Something that looks a little bit like this, as a matter of fact, for the riverbank. Again, something really simple. And we can even see it a little better from over on this side as well. Each of these areas where it was just like 1, maybe 2 blocks of a difference from the water level up to where the terrain met it. Something nice and simple to kind of blend those together, and that helps us see a little bit better all of the areas that we really need to hone in and focus on, such as this spot right here, or even where I'm standing as we speak. These are all of the areas that are going to get that special attention and focus into trying to turn into something that blends really nicely with both the river existing here and also the terrain that it's connected to outside of the river. And I think we've set ourselves up nicely with this cliff face right here that we've built our large tree upon. This can act as a nice little guide as to the styling and sort of detail that we want to put in any of these cliff sides that are right next to the river. I have right here a bunch of the blocks that we had used in those instances that should cover us pretty well for our uses here, and I want to go ahead and get started on those, but I'm not going to time lapse it. Instead, we're going to try and work on this a little bit together, so I'll try to walk you through a little bit as we go about it. So starting on the opposite side of the river, right over here underneath where we've got our tree, the first thing that I have in mind is that I want to start from the bottom up. I'm not sure how the top of this is going to turn out, or really what we're going to do with it. So for now, I'm just going to start down here where I kind of have a good idea as to how I want it to look. We're going to carve into this wall right here, start getting some of our darker blocks where it's going to be a little bit more shaded towards the center. And then out towards the edges, we'll get a little bit lighter, but not too light on the stone palette. And as we do that, I'll kind of work myself up a block. We'll see if there's any shaping that I want to try and do, and then we'll kind of go layer by layer. So we've got our first 2 layers in at the bottom with a little bit of the shading darker towards the center, and then a little bit lighter as we make our way out. Couple of highlights, a little bit of andesite right there, a little bit over there. And by doing the first 2 layers, I'm starting to feel like what we're going to do right here would benefit more from an overhang as opposed to a sheer cliff that kind of dips in a little bit towards the top. And to better explain what I mean, if we look at it from the side here, I think this would do better if the top of it kind of juts out over top the water, more so than if we just rounded this top edge a little bit, and then you are left with obviously a sheer cliff, but it kind of rounds out and it doesn't really overhang at all. Some of these areas might benefit a little bit better, specifically something like this right here, if we just round out the top a little bit and then have a little bit of a drop down to the water. And then other areas such as here and potentially even way up there are going to benefit from having an overhang instead. What this also does is rather than having everything kind of be one specific style, we get a little bit of variation in how the river blends with the neighboring terrain, whether it's the small riverbank here, whether it's an overhang cliff, whether it's a normal cliff face. Gives us all of these different options and all of these different things that we can do to make the place look as natural as possible. So if we get something pretty simple like this, just 3 different layers of some stone to just kind of help us shape it out. Obviously, it's not going to stay smooth stone like this, but something that I had on me that's a nice clean block that we can use to sort of shape this out a little bit better. I started on this bottom layer by adding a couple blocks of stone jutting out from how the wall had looked initially. And from there, as we went up, I started to add a little bit more. One of the more important details with shaping this out, however, is that you don't want to just throw blocks 1 block out from where the wall was all the way through. Then you're going to end up with these weird stair-step kind of shapes forming, and it's not going to look very natural whatsoever. So you can actually see with the dirt in the wall right here, areas where I did not add any stone that juts out from it, and what that does is it gives us these shapes on each layer where you can kind of see the rock formation in a more natural light, where you get these curves that kind of make their way out and eventually end up forming this curve from the side as well for this overhang that we have. If I were to have put stone on each one of these instances where the wall was before, you end up with the same shape on repeat. you get these harsh lines going into the wall, and it starts to look incredibly man-made and a little jarring on the eyes. So we're doing our best to avoid that. On the second layer, it was a little bit of the same, right? We brought some more out. We had some of the stone that would sit a little bit flush with the last layer. Some of it would come out a little bit further. Some would come out a lot further. And it would be a bit of a blend of all of those different details to arrive where we did. Now, this is a pretty short example of a little cliff face that we got to do right here. So there's not too much more. It just goes up a couple of blocks and then we're kind of level with the top of the hill right there. So at this point, I think I've shaped it out enough to go grab some dirt and grass blocks for the top of it. And then I'm going to bring a stone cutter over here as well, and I'm going to mix in some stairs and slabs of just this regular stone color throughout, just to kind of shape the place up a little bit. Once I do that, I'll work on a little more of the shading underneath, and I think that'll be good for this little example right here. Well, I've played around with it for a little bit, but if we're being honest, I hate it. And I'm not exactly sure what the right answer is, but I think I don't like it because of how small this area is for us to try and make this cliff face happen. It just doesn't feel like it works. And I think it on its own is fine, but in the bigger picture, that's kind of where the issue arises. I think the detailing we've done in the cliff face works perfectly well. But I think it would work a lot better if it were on one of these longer stretches or in an area that just felt a little more intentional. This just feels weird. I think it has to do with how small of a hill it is that's clipping into the river. So I think I'm going to go ahead and redo this. We're going to tear this down. Maybe not entirely, but I'm going to try the rounded top of the hill and maybe see if we get something a little bit better that way. Sometimes simpler is better, and I think this is a prime case of that exact saying. I think it was just a little bit too much trying to force the issue there with that overhang, and I'm glad we tried it at the very least so that we could see how it turns out. But at the end of the day, this is a good lesson not to be afraid to change something up once you've committed to it, because sometimes the first idea isn't the best idea. I think in hindsight, after having experimented with both examples, this one definitely did a little bit better with a toned down cliff face and just a little bit of a rounded top up there. And I do believe this is going to be where our bridge begins that travels over to the other side anyway. So this will eventually be underneath some sort of bridge up top. I have no idea what we're going to build for it yet. But overall, I think once we start a bridge that kind of connects over here, and this starts to play a little bit of a sort of shaded, hidden underneath part of where the bridge starts, I think that is really going to look good in that case especially. So there's one example of how we are going to dress up the sides of this river here. There is a whole lot more cliff face to do, especially over on this side. And I do think that once we get to this large section right here, this is really where that overhang style can flourish. And I think we can make something that looks pretty cool out of it. It's going to take a little bit of time, but I think we can manage something nicely. We'll get to the rest of these cliff faces in just a minute. But before we do, there's a couple more trees we've got to add to our forest over there. We've got a couple more people who signed up to support over there on Patreon, and that means we've got a couple more trees that we need to build. See, normally this is the kind of thing that I would just scrap and then not even feature in this video at all and go back to the drawing board and try again. But I do think there is some value in keeping this here in the video. I've spent the better part of the past 3 or so hours working on all these cliff sides and trying to come up with what the solution is into the river here. And despite all of the work that I've put in over there and where we're standing down here, I'm just not happy with it. I've tried the rounded hill thing, which looked a little bit better than the overhang, and we even have the overhang over there, and it's on the larger side, that larger continuous wall, but even there, it doesn't really work as good. And at the end of the day, I think I just need to scrap this idea entirely. Not the river itself, but I think we've hit a point where this just isn't going to work. We've kind of run into a wall, and it's time to try something new. Something about having these cliff faces or overhangs over the side of the river just aren't working. It just doesn't really do it for me. It just, I don't know. It feels weird. It feels out of place. I can't quite describe it as much as I would like to be able to, but I honestly think we might be better off if we're just sticking to something a little closer to like what we have here, or even where we're standing right now, just a normal, unassuming transition onto the land. And I think a big part of that is going to be having to remove this hill right here so that we can make that work a little bit better. Because I, for the life of me, just cannot come up with a way to make this look good. Sometimes it just doesn't work. Sometimes you just don't get it right, but that's all right. No reason not to keep at it. Okay, this go around, I think we actually got something that is serviceable. I basically went throughout and I did what I think I said at first I wasn't going to do, and that was just blend all the terrain with the nearby hills and make it a little more gradual and easy on the eyes. Not only that, but I also went through and bone mealed under here to get a bunch of seagrass, and that helps it look a lot more natural. Again, your focus is not supposed to be on some of these smaller details like the bed of the river, right? Your eye is supposed to be drawn to some of the bigger builds in this world, such as the forest here, or the big tree, the house on the hill, all of these sorts of things, even the bridge that we're going to have going right over where we're sitting right now. All of these things are meant to draw your attention. So as long as at a glance the riverbed passes and doesn't really draw your attention away, it's doing its job. And overall, as we boat through it in that direction and then back out towards the ocean this way, I think we've got something that works really well. I did go ahead and leave this little mini cliffside that we did right there. I thought that was all right, but for the rest of it, just this nice, relaxed hill just works so much better than what I had initially put in place. And again, I think it's a really good lesson on sometimes less is more, and sometimes going a little simpler is not a bad choice at all. And from up here, we get a much better view of the river and all of the changes that we made on it, at least off in this direction. You see how much we've widened it out. There's even this section right here, which gets incredibly wide. And I think that works really well considering the fact that it just empties out into the ocean right as the fog rolls in right there. Now, of course, I mentioned a little earlier, the river does kind of dead end right here, and that'll be a project for later on down the line, specifically when I'm a little better geared for it and I have things like beacons to do that much digging. The good news is I'm not in a rush to be doing any of that at the moment. I really wanted to focus on what was closer to home right here and something that we'd see a little bit more often. So I mentioned it just a little bit earlier, but we of course need a bridge before we're done here. I can't help but feel like it would be a big shame if we went through all of that work to do the river and we didn't even put a bridge across it. Now, I think I have an idea as to how I want to go about doing this bridge, at least what style I want to do it in, and then some of the materials that I want to use. So right here, I've got a little bit of a sneak peek at what we're going to be doing for said bridge. We're going to have some accents using some deep slate and some spruce. That'll kind of make up a lot of kind of the walkway, the floor, and then a little bit of kind of the rail, I guess. And then this will be the bulk of the material that we actually use for the bridge itself, at least the sides, the exterior, all of that sort of stuff. So to give you guys a little bit of an insight into my mindset here, this is kind of what we're going for. Now, on the left side, we have the base palette that's going to cover most of the area, and we've got kind of our lighter block over here with the light gray wool all the way over to a cobblestone, which has a little bit more of those darker hues in it. This will be completely random textured, all mixed together, with just a little sprinkle of this light gray terracotta, which just brings out a little bit more of those reddish hues in a stone palette. Now, I would also usually include something like light gray concrete maybe to get a little more of that as well, but because we're going to be working in and around water, I felt like it was probably best if we just leave that out. And over here on the right, we have our shading palette, so this will be whenever we need to make things a little darker. We have tuff, we have our acacia logs, and then we have smooth basalt. And by smooth basalt, I of course mean polished basalt. Editing Cody here. Quick side note, I don't know why I was showing off polished basalt in this clip when I very clearly was using regular basalt. I have no idea what happened there or why I grabbed those. I realized it after the fact, but anyway, ignore the polished basalt. We're using regular basalt. Carry on. But what these darker colors are going to allow us to do is shade the bridge a little bit down next to the water, especially where the supports of the bridge start to dip underwater. We can really transition into these darker colors to really make the stone look like it's wet, or just that it's been exposed to water for, you know, years or however long the bridge has been here. Just having it get a little darker as it gets towards the water and underwater, I think is going to be a good play. Same can be said for the parts of the stone that will be underneath the bridge, where the sunlight isn't directly hitting it. We'll of course want that to appear a little darker as well, just as one of those light shading techniques that can add a bunch to a build. We of course have been playing around with a lot of shading with our builds so far in this world, and I guess I've only really done one structure so far, but you get the idea. Shading is one of the big things that I'm trying to learn here, and it's also one of the biggest steps that you can take in your builds and improving the quality of them is when you start to use this shading. I've already seen it quite a bit in the things that I've been doing. So now that we know what build style we're going to be going with here and the palette, I hope I've shed some insight on it so that as you see it come together, you can kind of see a little bit of what I've been talking about and how it's implemented, and maybe it'll spark a little something for you as well. So with that said, why don't we build our very first bridge? We can kind of see it a little bit already over the hill, but as we round our little bend in the road right here, a couple of things that you'll notice. First, here's how the bridge is looking off in the distance with our new changes to the river. And secondly, I went ahead and planted a flower down here. I felt like a little lily in the valley would be a perfect little touch for this area, where in a previous episode, we figured out that we had this big beam of light that comes down from the foliage up top, this little gap in the branches of the tree that we built, and I think it is perfectly placed in this little patch of light as one of those nice subtle little touches on the road. Back to the bridge at hand, however, I think we've got something that works pretty well. Now, you might be thinking initially that this doesn't really fit the theme of like the house we built and kind of what we've been doing over here in the fantasy area. And while it could still work for that, this is more in line with what we're going to start seeing over in this direction, over on this part of our world. I've talked about it a number of times at this point, but we're going to have 3 different areas. The first one we've been working on is going to be our fantasy area. We have another one beyond the trees over in that direction, and then our third one is across the river over there. So you can consider this bridge a little sneak peek at the kind of styling that we're going to see a lot of over in this direction. I'm not going to come out and say it quite yet because I have quite the build to launch this area and get everyone introduced to the style that we're going to be going for over in this direction. I'm really excited to get to it, and I felt like the bridge was a nice little tie-in to kind of dip our feet just a little bit in the waters of what we're going to be doing over here. And overall, I think the bridge turned out pretty well. It's probably the best bridge I've ever built, and I have built very few bridges, so it's a pretty low bar to clear. That being said, I do feel like I learned a thing or two about bridge building in here. I was looking at a lot of different inspiration, a lot of art pieces, not even like Minecraft related per se, but just a lot of drawings and really focusing in on that side of things, just kind of seeing where people's minds go when they're drawing a bridge, when they're creating it from an art perspective. And I tried to take some elements that I was seeing here and there from different bridges, try to merge it together. Obviously, I wanted to style it a certain way in game here. We've got these 2 main supports culverts that come down into the water, and kind of these 3 different archways, with of course the main one in the center being where you might boat through. I wanted the bridge to come up far enough above the surface of the water so that you could fit a reasonable enough size boat through. Not that we have boats like that in Minecraft, but you know, just use your imagination a little bit. And another thing I wanted to make sure that I did right was all of the curves here. I wanted to get the shape perfect in everywhere that I could. So a big part of that was of course the archways down below. But another big part of that was the railing here. We used some deep slate for it, a mix of polished deep slate and deep slate bricks. And I used a bunch of slabs and even a little bit of some stairs and walls for kind of these big torches that the campfires represent, as well as some anvils at the very end of it just to kind of tie it into the wall back there. But I went ahead and used that to try and really get this shape up top to sort of accent the rest of the bridge, kind of cap it off, if you will. And I think that alone has done so much for the quality of this build. It really comes across as though the shapes were really well done, and for that I think I'm really proud of this bridge. We'll likely see many more bridges built over the course of this world, but I think that's a really good start. Not to mention, we're starting to fill out our forest just a little bit more over here as more people join up on the Patreon. So shout out to the 3 of you guys who joined this week to start filling out a little bit more of the forest here. As we start to get a couple more layers of trees back here, we're really gonna start to have a good look off in this direction. And with that bridge done and out of the way, it may not be as long as the last one. We did go about an hour long last week, but the digging for this river took absolutely forever. And I've been working on a pretty big build that's going to be upcoming in one of the future episodes. Something that is kind of a multi-week thing to try and get built and planned and all of that. So that's taking a little bit of time as well. I'm excited for when you guys can finally see it. I'm going to try and see if I can't get it done for this next week, but we'll see how all of that goes. As always, I want to say a massive shout out to everyone who's supporting the content over on Patreon. It's thanks to all of you guys whose names are showing up on screen right now that I'm able to do this full time like I do, whether it's here or over on Twitch where we're streaming. A big shout out to you guys, you make it possible. And of course, speaking of streaming, don't forget that if you're watching this the day it's out on Wednesday or even the next day on Thursday, I'll be live this Friday over on Twitch. Every week we stream from this world doing some of the behind the scenes stuff over here. So definitely come join us over there. It's a good time. And I do believe that is all I have for you guys. So I hope that today you felt just a little bit inspired.